How would you react if your entire professional identity was erased by a typewriter and handed directly to the co-star sitting right next to you? That exact corporate humiliation hit Wayne Rogers right when MASH was dominating American television. Realizing the network executives were quietly hollowing out his character Trapper John to build a pedestal for the leading man, Rogers executed the ultimate nuclear option. He kicked away a massive paycheck and walked straight off the lot of a guaranteed hit. Blacklisted by vindictive studio heads in retaliation, he refused to crawl back for bit parts. Instead, he traded his scrubs for a tailored suit, engineering a ruthless financial counterattack that left the very executives who tried to ruin him completely outmaneuvered. The television industry of the late 1960s and early 1970s functioned strictly as an industrial assembly line designed to sell soap and automobiles. The brutal contract practices that had defined the golden age of the historical studio system at MGM and Fox had simply been repackaged for the television era. The remnants of that old system had mutated into a corporate television machine where networks churned out content with ruthless, unfeeling efficiency. Actors were viewed merely as depreciating assets, biological cogs meant to hit their marks, recite their lines, and stay entirely out of the executive's way. If you were a working actor in this era, you were subjected to a grueling, unforgiving schedule that broke down even the most resilient performers, and the network's brass made sure you knew you were entirely disposable. Wayne Rogers navigated this environment as a highly educated pragmatist. Born in Alabama in 1933, Rogers was a Princeton graduate and a former Navy navigator, bringing a razor-sharp intellect to an industry built on superficiality. He understood the business mechanics of television better than most of his peers, which made the indignities of the daily hustle even more difficult to swallow. Throughout the 1960s, he found himself trapped in the purgatory of the guest star circuit, grinding out appearances on procedural shows like The Fugitive and The FBI. He was paying his dues, but he was also acutely aware that playing the heavy of the week was a fast track to permanent industry obscurity. He possessed an undeniable rugged screen presence and a natural charisma that commanded attention the second he stepped into the frame. Yet, the casting directors of the era consistently passed him over for leading roles, boxing him out of the upper echelon of television stardom. The industry was aggressively rigid, and breaking out of the character-actor classification required either an incredible stroke of luck or a massive corporate mandate. Rogers spent over a decade surviving on the margins of the studio lots, watching lesser talents secure lucrative syndication deals while he hustled for daily rates. He knew he had the capability to anchor a major production, but the Hollywood gatekeepers simply refused to hand him the keys to the vehicle. The industry shifted violently in 1972 when 20th Century Fox decided to adapt a massive counterculture feature film into a primetime television comedy. Translating the dark, anti-establishment tone of a wartime surgical hospital into a format palatable for middle America was considered an immense financial risk. CBS executives were nervous about the subject matter, demanding a specific character dynamic to anchor the show and keep the audience engaged. They already had their eye on Alan Alda for the lead, but they knew the character of Hawkeye Pierce required a very specific counterweight. They needed a secondary lead who could stand toe-to-toe with Alda, a co-conspirator who could project both cynical humor and rugged, dependable physical presence. When Wayne Rogers walked into the audition room, He immediately delivered the exact frequency the nervous producers were desperately seeking. He brought a loose, relaxed masculinity and a sharp comedic timing that cut straight through the sterile corporate atmosphere of the casting office. The producers offered him the role of Trapper, John McIntyre, selling him on a very specific and legally binding creative promise. He was explicitly told that the show would be a two-headed monster, a true ensemble where Trapper and Hawkeye operated as absolute equals. For a veteran actor who had spent a decade fighting for scraps, this was the monumental breakthrough he had been waiting for his entire career. Production commenced on the Fox lot, plunging the cast into the grueling reality of shooting a single-camera comedy under the punishing California sun. The outdoor sets in Malibu were physically demanding, requiring long hours in the dirt while wearing heavy military fatigues. But despite the harsh conditions and the constant pressure from the network to keep costs down, magic began to happen the moment the cameras rolled. Rogers and Alda possessed a rare, instantaneous chemistry that simply cannot be manufactured by writers or engineered by executives in a boardroom. They were two highly intelligent men who understood the rhythm of comedy, feeding off each other's energy to elevate the written material. In those early days, the professional relationship between the two actors was collaborative, respectful, and highly productive for the studio. They worked together to find the timing of a scene, tightening the banter and refining the physical comedy until it was absolutely seamless. Trapper John quickly became the beating heart of the swamp. He was written as the more approachable, generous, and outwardly loyal of the two surgeons. While Hawkeye delivered the biting, cynical monologues, Trapper provided the grounded, relatable humanity that kept the show from becoming too abrasive for mainstream viewers. It was a perfect theatrical balance, and it was the singular element that kept the entire production from collapsing under its own weight. What the network retrospectives rarely mention is that the first season of the show was actually a catastrophic ratings failure. The American public was initially confused by the tone, and CBS executives were quietly preparing the paperwork to cancel the massive financial investment. The studio was actively bleeding money, and the corporate pressure raining down on the producers was immense and unrelenting on a daily basis. The only thing that stopped the executives from pulling the plug entirely was the undeniable lightning in a bottle they saw between Alda and Rogers. The studio recognized that the Hawkeye and Trapper dynamic was a highly marketable asset, buying the show just enough time to find its audience. By the second season, the television audience finally caught on, and the ratings skyrocketed, transforming the struggling sitcom into a cultural juggernaut. Wayne Rogers was suddenly thrust into the blinding spotlight of national stardom, becoming a fixture in millions of living rooms every single week. He was pulling in staggering amounts of fan mail, receiving immense validation from a public that had thoroughly fallen in love with Trapper John. Demographic data from the studio showed that Rogers was particularly beloved by female viewers and working-class audiences who found Hawkeye's intellectualism somewhat alienating. He had finally achieved the elusive top-tier success he had chased for 10 years, proving his worth to the very executives who had previously ignored him. Every single actor on that Fox lot was bound by contracts that gave the studio near total ownership of their public and professional lives. The executives operated with an iron grip on the industry, dictating not just what roles you played, but how you were perceived by the press. If a performer started to ask too many questions about their character development, The studio had an entire publicity department ready to label them as difficult. Rogers was navigating a system designed to strip away an actor's autonomy the moment they stepped out of line and questioned the hierarchy. He was a man who valued his intellectual independence, but he was working for a corporation that only valued absolute obedience. However, the corporate culture of network television was fundamentally opposed to the concept of sharing power or splitting the spotlight between two equals. Television is a business built on centralized branding, and executives despise the financial leverage that comes with having two equally vital stars on one show. As the syndication value of the series began to climb into the millions, the studio brass quietly began to reassess their original promise to Rogers. Why pay two men a premium salary when you can consolidate the narrative focus and turn one actor into the undisputed face of the franchise? The decision was made in the sterile boardrooms of Los Angeles, far away from the dirt and the camaraderie of the production set. Unbeknownst to Rogers, the subtle shift in power had already begun during the height of the show's massive sophomore success. The network directives were quietly handed down to the writers' room, altering the distribution of screen time and the structure of the punchlines. Hawkeye was slowly being elevated to the status of a solo protagonist, while Trapper was systematically being pushed into the background as a supporting player. Rogers was still hitting his marks, delivering brilliant performances and drawing in massive viewership numbers, entirely unaware of the corporate betrayal taking place behind the scenes. He thought he was building a legacy as an equal partner in a television masterpiece, but the studio had other plans entirely. The daily reality of a television production set is entirely dictated by the distribution of dialogue in the script pages handed out each morning. An actor's standing in the industry is not measured by their face on a billboard, but by the weight of their narrative arc in the writer's room. After two highly successful seasons, Wayne Rogers began to notice a stark mathematical shift in the pages arriving at his dressing room door. The intricate two-handed banter that originally defined the series was being quietly dismantled by the network's writing staff. He was still required to hit his marks and deliver his lines, but the substance of his character was being systematically hollowed out. In the television industry, the hierarchy is established by the division of the A story and the B story within any given episode. The A story drives the plot, commands the dramatic tension, and guarantees the most screen time for the central star. Rogers realized with cold clarity that Trapper John was being permanently relegated to the B story, demoted to providing comic relief while the heavy lifting went elsewhere. His character was being stripped of any professional agency, kept around merely to pour martinis and set up the punchlines for Hawkeye Pierce. For a seasoned actor who had signed on with the explicit promise of equal footing, this deliberate marginalization was an unforgivable insult. His management team had negotiated his contract based on the firm understanding that the two lead characters were designed to be completely interchangeable. The original creative pitch promised that Hawkeye and Trapper would share the burden of the narrative, operating as a unified front against the military establishment. However, the Hollywood machine rarely honors verbal agreements. When millions of dollars in advertising revenue dictate a different strategy, the network had identified Alan Alda as the singular marketable face of their franchise, and they issued a silent mandate to elevate him above the ensemble. Rogers was effectively trapped in a bait-and-switch operation, watching his promised co-lead status evaporate into the Malibu dust. The brutal typewriter erasure mentioned earlier didn't happen in a vacuum. It was executed with surgical precision during a season 1 episode titled Dear Dad. In the original source material, Trapper John held the explicit rank of the unit's highly specialized thoracic surgeon. That specific medical credential justified his rebellious arrogance. Yet when the fresh script pages arrived, the network had casually stripped that exact specialty from Rogers and handed it to Alan Alda. The writers literally rewrote his professional worth out of existence just to consolidate the leading man's authority. To the average viewer, a shift in a fictional medical title might seem like a minor continuity error, but in the television business, it is an aggressive demotion. Taking a character's defining trait and giving it to another actor is a deliberate corporate demotion, orchestrated directly by the showrunners. Rogers recognized this maneuver immediately. It was a clear signal that the producers viewed him as entirely secondary to the main attraction. His professional identity on the show was being dismantled piece by piece to build a larger pedestal for his co-star. He was no longer playing a peer, he was being forced into the role of a highly compensated cheerleader. Rogers did not suffer this indignity in silence. He took his grievances directly to the executive producers, Larry Gelbart and Gene Reynolds. These men were brilliant architects of television comedy, but they were also ruthless pragmatists charged with protecting the studio's most valuable asset. Rogers argued fiercely that the show was drifting too far from its roots, abandoning the sharp, cynical edge of the original source material. He pointed out that the series was transforming into a heavy-handed moralizing platform, centered entirely around the worldview of a single character. He wanted to maintain the grounded, dark reality of the original concept, but the showrunners had zero interest in his creative input. When you are generating massive ratings for a major broadcast network, the executives view the formula as utterly flawless and completely untouchable. Gelbart and Reynolds dismissed Rogers' concerns with the cold efficiency of men who had the full backing of the corporate boardroom. The Nielsen numbers were climbing every single week, proving to the studio brass that centralizing the narrative was the correct financial decision. In the brutal calculus of 1970s television, you do not adjust a machine that is printing money, even if those gears are actively crushing one of your actors. Rogers was told to stay in his lane, read the lines as written, and cash his checks without causing friction on the set. Refusing to back down, Rogers submitted multiple requests to the writers' room, begging for basic character development and internal conflict. He pitched storylines that would explore Trapper's background, his motivations, and his existence outside the shadow of the lead character. Every single proposal was intercepted and rejected by the network executives before it ever reached the production schedule. The studio had placed him firmly in the box of the affable sidekick, and they sealed it shut with absolute corporate authority. His talent, his intellect, and his dedication to the craft meant absolutely nothing against the rigid mandates of the network's syndication strategy. The psychological toll of showing up to a set where your capabilities are intentionally suppressed is a heavy burden for any professional. Rogers had to endure the daily grind of delivering dialogue that he knew was fundamentally beneath his skill level. He was earning a massive paycheck and enjoying the perks of national fame, but the professional humiliation was a constant grinding reality. He was surrounded by executives who smiled to his face while actively diminishing his worth in the daily production meetings. The situation had mutated from a dream job into a gilded cage, and Rogers was not the type of man to tolerate captivity. By the time the production wrapped on the third season in the spring of 1975, the series was an absolute titan in the broadcast landscape. The show commanded unprecedented ad rates, and the impending syndication deals were set to generate historic profits for the studio. Every working actor in Hollywood would have sold their soul for a guaranteed spot on the roster of a guaranteed hit. The financial security was absolute, and the conventional industry wisdom dictated that you ride the wave until the network finally canceled the program. However, Wayne Rogers operated on a different frequency. He valued his professional dignity far more than his weekly studio paycheck. In a move that sent shockwaves through the executive suites of Los Angeles, Wayne Rogers made the most aggressive play available to a television actor. He packed up his dressing room, walked off the Fox lot, and permanently severed ties with the most successful comedy in America. He did not negotiate a transition, he did not agree to a final character arc, and he absolutely refused to film a farewell episode. It was a clean, sudden, and brutal break from a corporate machine that had spent 3 years slowly shrinking his professional footprint. He walked away from millions of dollars in future earnings simply because he refused to be treated as a secondary asset. The sheer audacity of this walkout was unprecedented. Actors simply did not quit #1 shows at the peak of their popularity. Rogers genuinely believed that his sudden absence would send the studio into a blind panic, forcing them to realize his actual value to the franchise. He assumed his departure would derail the production schedule, giving him the leverage to return on his own creative and financial terms. He was betting his entire career on the assumption that the network could not maintain the massive ratings without his specific on-screen presence. It was a massive, high-stakes gamble against the house, driven by a deep sense of artistic pride and undeniable frustration. The brutal reality of the Hollywood replacement cycle is that the studio machine does not panic. It simply opens a casting binder. Network executives view actors as entirely interchangeable parts, biological units that can be swapped out over a single weekend. Before the industry trades even had time to print the story of his departure, the studio had already initiated the protocol to replace him. They had no intention of begging him to return or negotiating a better creative deal for his character. The network had a new co-star hired, vetted, fitted for wardrobe, and standing on the soundstage before the dust even settled. The studio brought in Mike Farrell to play B.J. Honeycutt, introducing a softer, less competitive dynamic that was specifically tailored to support the leading man. The transition was executed with terrifying efficiency. The show didn't miss a single beat, marching straight into its 4th season with massive viewership numbers. The corporate machine simply paved over Rogers' absence without a second thought, proving that the brand was always infinitely stronger than the individual performer. The network PR department barely acknowledged his departure, ensuring the audience immediately focused on the new, highly cooperative replacement. Wayne Rogers made the ultimate sacrifice, walking away from a monumental television hit because he fiercely refused to let his role be minimized by studio executives. He put his entire career on the line to prove that he was an indispensable pillar of the show's massive success. However, the true crushing blow came when he sat back and watched the network effortlessly sustain their astronomical ratings without him. He left the lot to protect his value, only to realize that the Hollywood machine considered him entirely brutally replaceable. Walking off a studio lot in 1975 constituted an act of open corporate warfare. 20th Century Fox was a sprawling empire, and they did not tolerate insubordination from the actors they viewed as their legal property. When Wayne Rogers drove off the Malibu set, the network executives immediately mobilized their legal department to crush his rebellion. They intended to make a highly visible example of him to deter any other television actors from getting similar ideas. The studio was determined to financially ruin him before he could even secure his next audition. The retaliation began with a massive, highly publicized lawsuit filed in the California courts. Fox sued Wayne Rogers for an astronomical $3.5 million, citing a blatant and malicious breach of contract. In the mid-1970s, that sum was designed to completely bankrupt a working television actor and seize their accumulated wealth. The studio fed the narrative to the industry trades, painting Rogers as an erratic liability who abandoned his crew without warning. The executives wanted him penniless, publicly humiliated and begging for a minor guest spot just to pay his legal fees. The studio lawyers marched into the preliminary hearings, fully expecting to steamroll the actor with their absolute corporate weight. They laid out their case before the judge, demanding the court enforce the ironclad terms of his multi-year television holding deal. But the Fox legal team had failed to verify one crucial foundational detail before filing their multi-million-dollar grievance. As the proceedings commenced, a shocking and entirely humiliating fact regarding the paperwork came to light. Wayne Rogers had never actually signed the finalized version of his official employment contract for 3 highly profitable seasons. The network had operated under the assumption that their rising star was legally locked down. But Rogers, possessing a sharp intellect and a background in contract analysis, had quietly refused to put his signature on the document. His objection centered entirely around an archaic, highly restrictive section of the paperwork known as the Morals Clause. This standard studio provision gave the network absolute authority to terminate an actor for any behavior they deemed publicly inappropriate. Rogers viewed the clause as an insulting, paternalistic mechanism designed to give the studio complete control over his private life. Because he never physically signed the document containing that specific clause, the entire contract was rendered legally unenforceable. The multi-million-dollar lawsuit orchestrated by Fox collapsed completely before it could ever reach a jury trial. The judge threw the case out, handing a monumental, unprecedented legal victory to a lone actor facing down a massive corporation. Rogers had outmaneuvered a legion of high-priced studio attorneys simply by reading the fine print and holding his ground. He embarrassed the network executives on a public stage, proving they had no legal ownership over his career or his personal autonomy. Winning a lawsuit against a major Hollywood studio is an incredibly rare feat, but it carries a silent, devastating penalty. Fox could not seize his bank accounts, but they wielded a far more dangerous weapon than a court order. The executives immediately pivoted from a visible legal assault to an invisible, highly coordinated industry whisper campaign. Studio heads talk to each other constantly, and they maintain an unspoken blacklist for talent that disrupts the corporate machinery. The word was sent down through the executive ranks that Wayne Rogers was entirely off limits for any major network production. Almost overnight, the label of difficult to work with was permanently attached to his casting profile across town. In the entertainment business, that specific phrase is the equivalent of a corporate death sentence for a leading man. It signals to directors, showrunners, and producers that an actor is a financial liability who refuses to follow orders blindly. Rogers was no longer viewed as the rugged, charismatic star who helped build the biggest comedy on television. He was now classified as a rogue operator, a man who would gladly embarrass a studio over a contract dispute. The immediate professional fallout was staggering in its speed and its ruthless efficiency. Scripts that had been verbally promised to him while he was still on his hit show suddenly vanished without a trace. High-profile meetings with major film directors were abruptly canceled by studio heads, who refused to greenlight his participation. He would get close to securing a leading role in a new pilot, only to have the offer mysteriously rescinded at the 11th hour. The gatekeepers of the 1970s studio system were actively slamming the doors in his face, ensuring he remained entirely unemployed. Instead of anchoring major dramatic features, the few offers that did filter through the blockade were borderline insulting. Rogers was suddenly being pitched guest spots on low-budget procedural dramas and heavily sanitized made-for-television movies. These were the exact same entry-level gigs he had fought through a decade earlier, before he ever became a household name. The studios were sending a very clear message about where they believed his new place in the hierarchy was located. They were forcing him to start over from the absolute bottom, stripping away all the momentum he had generated on a hit series. The financial realities of this silent embargo hit him hard and fast in the years immediately following his exit. Without a steady television paycheck or access to top-tier film roles, his acting income plummeted dramatically, almost overnight. He went from being one of the highest-paid sitcom stars in America to hustling for scraps on the independent circuit. The industry was intentionally starving him out, demonstrating the raw power they held over the livelihoods of their talent. They wanted him to understand that surviving outside the protection of the studio system was an exercise in pure financial endurance. The chilling effect on the rest of the acting community was immediate, profound, and highly beneficial for the networks. Other television stars watched Rogers' career hit a brick wall, quickly realizing that the studios held the power to destroy a leading man overnight. Nobody stepped in to defend him publicly, terrified that the same executive wrath would be redirected toward their own contracts. He was left entirely on an island, a cautionary tale discussed in hushed tones at industry parties and casting offices. The total isolation proved exactly how quickly Hollywood will abandon a colleague when the studio bosses draw a line in the sand. Looking back years later, Rogers maintained a stoic posture regarding his explosive departure and the ensuing legal battle. He stated publicly that he had zero regrets about standing up for his principles and refusing to sign a restrictive contract. He firmly believed that accepting the diminished role on his former show would have destroyed his professional self-respect entirely. However, even with his defiant stance, he eventually had to acknowledge the brutal collateral damage of his decision. He admitted that challenging the corporate system had fundamentally derailed his trajectory and cost him the prime years of his acting career. He won the legal skirmish against 20th Century Fox, securing a victory that very few actors ever achieve against a conglomerate. But the American television industry operates like a cartel, punishing those who break ranks with relentless, quiet efficiency. His refusal to be controlled by a signature saved him from bankruptcy, but it handed the studios the exact ammunition they needed. He successfully proved that he was an independent contractor, but the executives simply decided they no longer required his services. Wayne Rogers beat the system in a court of law, securing his freedom from a studio that viewed him as absolute property. But in Hollywood, proving that you are smarter than the executives is the fastest way to get your name permanently erased from the call sheet. He walked out of the courtroom with his dignity fully intact and his bank account protected from a massive corporate raid. Yet that very same legal triumph officially cemented his status as a man the industry would actively refuse to hire. Wayne Rogers won the legal battle because he refused to sign on the dotted line, beating the studio at their own game. However, that very victory handed the Hollywood machine the exact excuse they needed to systematically destroy his future. Surviving a direct legal confrontation with a major studio leaves an actor with a very specific permanent set of professional scars. Even after the dust from the Fox lawsuit settled and the network officially backed off, Wayne Rogers faced an entirely new barrier. The Hollywood machine rarely relies on a formal written blacklist to keep an actor entirely out of the production schedule. Instead, the industry deploys a far more effective and completely legal mechanism known as typecasting to permanently neutralize rebellious talent. Typecasting operates as a calculated risk management strategy utilized by television networks. When an actor becomes heavily associated with a massively syndicated hit, executives refuse to cast them in anything that contradicts that image. They view the actor entirely as a corporate mascot, a recognizable face that immediately triggers a specific consumer response for advertisers. Casting directors looked at Wayne Rogers and did not see a versatile, classically trained actor hungry for complex, dramatic material. They only saw trapper John McIntyre, the affable martini-drinking sidekick with a quick smile and a complete lack of authority. Whenever his management team submitted him for gritty, dramatic features, the studio gatekeepers immediately threw his headshot in the trash. Executives explicitly told his agents that audiences would be entirely confused if they saw the beloved sitcom doctor holding a weapon or playing a villain. He was chained to the exact same lighthearted secondary persona he had sacrificed his position on a #1 show to escape. This aggressive, industry-wide pigeonholing entirely derailed his momentum and severely crippled his ability to generate a steady, reliable income. The few casting directors willing to overlook the difficult label attached to his file would only offer him variations of the exact same character. He was forced to read for parts that required him to play the supportive best friend, the cheerful neighbor, or the comedic foil. The dramatic leading man roles he desperately wanted were completely walled off, reserved strictly for actors who had never crossed a network president. The financial reality of a stalled career in the late 1970s was a brutal wake-up call for a man who previously commanded top dollar. Rogers was watching his bank accounts drain while he paid off the expensive legal teams required to defend him against the Fox contract dispute. To keep the lights on, he had to swallow his pride and accept roles in mid-tier television movies and entirely forgettable mini-series. He was working for a fraction of his previous episodic quote, effectively subsidizing the network's punishment by accepting bargain basement rates. Every time he stepped onto a set for a television movie of the week, the crew treated him like a relic from a past era. He was no longer the undisputed co-lead of a cultural phenomenon. He was a guest star brought in strictly for his residual name recognition. The industry operates on a ruthless hierarchy, and an actor's status on a call sheet dictates exactly how they are treated by the production staff. Rogers was forced to endure the quiet indignity of watching lesser talents dictate the pace of a shoot while he waited in a tiny trailer. By 1979, the financial strain and the sheer exhaustion of hustling for minor television spots forced him to make a massive creative compromise. He desperately needed a steady television contract to stabilize his income and prove to the town that he was still a viable, reliable leading man. CBS offered him the starring role in House Calls, a new half-hour sitcom designed to capitalize on his specific, pre-established audience demographic. There was only one catch. The network required him to play Dr. Charlie Michaels, a witty, anti-establishment surgeon working in a chaotic hospital. Accepting the role was an exercise in pure, unadulterated irony for a man who had famously walked away from the exact same premise. He had torched his career 4 years earlier to avoid playing a television doctor, only to be forced right back into the exact same scrubs. The executives at CBS knew exactly what they were doing. They were buying the residual goodwill of Trapper John without having to pay Fox for the copyright. Rogers took the job because he understood the cold, hard mathematics of the industry, but the creative surrender tasted entirely like ash. House Calls proved to be a solid, dependable hit for the network, running for 3 consecutive years and stabilizing his financial situation. Rogers even earned a Golden Globe nomination for his performance, proving to the press that he could absolutely carry a series as the undisputed lead. But behind the scenes, the critical acclaim and the steady paychecks provided absolutely zero professional satisfaction or artistic validation. The show was simply a shiny new cage, constructed entirely from the exact same corporate mandates that had driven him out of his previous series. The Golden Globe nomination did not serve as a stepping stone to serious film roles. It acted as the final nail in the coffin. It signaled to the entire industry that Wayne Rogers was permanently and undeniably locked into the genre of light medical comedy. The town collectively agreed that he had found his lane, and no major film studio was ever going to risk pulling him out of it. He finally secured his name at the absolute top of the call sheet, but he was reigning over a genre he fundamentally despised. As the 1980s approached, a deep, heavy bitterness began to settle over his view of the entire Hollywood apparatus. He had given his prime years, his undeniable charisma, and his absolute dedication to an industry that viewed him as nothing more than a disposable prop. He realized that the entertainment system does not operate on a meritocracy. It actively punishes intellect and rewards absolute, unquestioning compliance. The studios had extracted millions of dollars in value from his face and then discarded him the second he demanded a fair creative exchange. This profound sense of betrayal triggered a massive shift in how he decided to operate for the remainder of his professional life. He recognized that as long as his primary income relied on the approval of a network casting director, he would never have any actual power. The only way to beat the executives who had actively derailed his acting career was to acquire more capital than the men signing his checks. Rogers made the calculated, cold-blooded decision to pivot away from the sound stages and entirely focus his formidable intellect on the stock market. He began applying the exact same rigorous analysis he used for script breakdowns to corporate balance sheets, real estate portfolios, and wealth management strategies. He refused to be a victim of the studio system, deciding instead to master the exact financial mechanisms that the studio bosses used to control the town. He quietly built an independent investment empire, operating far outside the jurisdiction of any Hollywood executive or television network president. The man who had been boxed into the corner by the entertainment industry decided to simply buy the entire building. This transition served as a matter of basic survival and a calculated grab for absolute autonomy. By shifting his focus entirely to finance, he completely neutralized the only weapon the studios had left against him, the power to deny him a paycheck. The networks could block him from starring in feature films, but they could absolutely not stop him from dominating the commercial real estate market. He effectively fired the entire Hollywood establishment, taking absolute control of his own corporate destiny and permanently walking away from the casting grid. He successfully engineered his own total financial rebirth, securing a level of massive wealth that most working television actors could never even comprehend. But the ultimate tragedy of this transition is that it was born entirely out of necessity, not out of a genuine desire to abandon his craft. He was a trained, passionate actor who was literally forced to become a Wall Street heavyweight because his chosen industry completely shut him out. He won the ultimate battle for financial independence and absolute self-reliance against a system designed to systematically break his resolve. But the victory was entirely hollow when measured against the original artistic ambitions he had carried onto the studio lot decades earlier. He proved that he could outsmart the Hollywood executives in the boardroom, building an ironclad fortune that insulated him from their petty retaliations. Yet, in securing that financial fortress, he officially surrendered any hope of ever being recognized as the serious, dramatic powerhouse he always knew he was. Wayne Rogers was forced to become a millionaire in a suit because the machine successfully ensured he would never be anything more than a punchline in Scrubs. Leaving the entertainment industry to conquer the financial sector is a transition most actors fundamentally lack the discipline to execute. Wayne Rogers did not merely dabble in stock trading. He assaulted the financial markets with the exact same ruthless precision he once applied to dissecting a script. He recognized that Wall Street operated on a brutal, unsentimental metric where raw capital dictated the hierarchy, entirely bypassing the subjective whims of casting directors. He established a formidable investment corporation, aggressively acquiring commercial real estate, managing complex banking portfolios, and financing independent business ventures. For the first time in his professional life, his worth was calculated by ironclad ledgers and profit margins, not by the fickle opinions of a network executive. This financial empire provided him with an impenetrable fortress of wealth, completely insulating him from the desperate hustle that destroys aging television actors. He was no longer a hired hand waiting by the telephone for an agent to secure a daily rate on a dusty sound stage. He became the man writing the checks, operating from corporate boardrooms, where Hollywood producers were viewed as nothing more than risky liabilities. The industry that had systematically frozen him out was entirely powerless against a man who possessed enough liquid capital to finance his own studio. Rogers had successfully transferred his formidable intellect into a highly lucrative arena where network blacklists held absolutely zero jurisdictional authority. His undeniable expertise in wealth management eventually brought him back to the television cameras, but strictly on his own uncompromising terms. He joined the Fox News Channel as a regular senior panelist on the highly rated financial analysis program Cashin' In. This was not a vanity project or a desperate attempt to cling to the fading embers of his celebrity status. He was delivering hard, unvarnished economic strategy to millions of viewers, breaking down complex tax laws and market fluctuations with absolute authority. He sat at the anchor desk in a tailored suit, projecting the commanding presence of a fiscal heavyweight rather than a subservient sitcom sidekick. The profound irony of his return to national broadcasting was not lost on the veterans of the Hollywood machine. The television executives had spent decades trying to suppress his voice and limit his influence, insisting he stick to reading the jokes they provided. Now he was commanding live, unscripted airtime on a major cable network, entirely free from the creative control of any showrunner or producer. He did not have to hit an artificial mark, wait for canned laughter, or deliver dialogue designed to prop up another actor's ego. He was finally the undisputed authority in the frame, commanding the exact respect he had aggressively demanded back on the Malibu studio lot. His credibility in the financial sector reached its absolute zenith when he was formally summoned to Washington, D.C. as an expert witness. Wayne Rogers sat before the United States Congress, delivering sworn testimony regarding the complexities of banking regulations and corporate tax structures. This was the ultimate, undeniable validation of his intellect, taking place in a room that terrified the very studio executives who had previously dismissed him. He was actively advising the federal government on national economic policy, operating in a sphere of influence that completely dwarfed the entertainment industry. The former contract player had elevated himself into a legitimate high-stakes power broker on the national stage. However, a massive bank account and a congressional mandate cannot entirely erase the cultural footprint of a massively syndicated television hit. No matter how many millions he managed or how accurately he predicted the stock market, the ghost of the 4077th was permanently attached to his shadow. Whenever he granted interviews to discuss his latest real estate acquisition or market forecast, the journalist invariably hijacked the conversation. Reporters would impatiently rush through the financial questions just to ask him about his former co-stars or his reasons for leaving the comedy series. The Chiron beneath his face on the news broadcasts rarely identified him simply as an investment CEO. It almost always read, former television star. This constant, unavoidable pivot back to his past was a source of quiet, grinding frustration for a man entirely focused on his current achievements. He had spent decades building a legitimate corporate legacy, yet the public squarely refused to acknowledge anything he accomplished after 1975. He was a financial titan trapped inside the public memory of a man holding a prop martini glass in a fictional combat zone. The media reduced his highly sophisticated business empire to a mere footnote, treating his Wall Street success as a quirky postscript to his acting career. The Hollywood machine had lost the ability to control his bank account, but it entirely maintained its iron grip on his public identity. By the time he reached his late 70s, his acting career had completely flatlined, a casualty of his own refusal to play the Hollywood game. He had long since stopped pursuing dramatic roles or entertaining the idea of a late-stage industry comeback. He accepted that the studio gates were permanently locked to him as a leading man, choosing to focus entirely on maintaining his financial portfolio. He was aging comfortably outside the chaotic bubble of Los Angeles, projecting the image of a dignified elder statesman who had successfully beaten the system. But exactly when his legacy seemed entirely secure, a sudden, messy legal entanglement threatened to completely derail his final years. In 2013, when Rogers was 80 years old, the carefully constructed privacy of his later life was shattered by a highly publicized civil dispute. A woman came forward and filed a formal paternity lawsuit against the former actor, legally claiming that he was the biological father of her child. This was not a quiet, behind closed doors corporate negotiation. It was a deeply personal, highly invasive legal battle playing out in the public record. The lawsuit demanded official recognition and financial support, instantly generating a wave of tabloid headlines that he had spent decades carefully avoiding. The man, who had previously outsmarted a major studio's legal department, was suddenly trapped in a grueling, intimate court fight. The paternity case dragged through the legal system, casting a heavy shadow over his final decade. It remained an active, unresolved dispute as his physical health rapidly deteriorated in the mid-2010s. In late 2015, Rogers suffered from a severe bout of pneumonia. The financial empire he had built offered no leverage against a failing immune system. He passed away on December 31st at the age of 82, far removed from the broadcast studios he once challenged. Wayne Rogers died on December 31st, 2015, passing away quietly on New Year's Eve at the age of 82. The Hollywood public relations machine, which had ignored him for decades, instantly shifted into gear to capitalize on the nostalgia of his passing. The network obituaries were written and published within minutes, adhering strictly to the mandated corporate narrative regarding his career. The industry trades dedicated massive paragraphs to his 3-year stint on a comedy series, while entirely glossing over the systemic blacklisting that followed. His vast financial empire, his congressional testimony, and the unresolved paternity suit were buried at the very bottom of the press releases. The entertainment industry wrote his final chapter exactly the way they had always intended to frame him. Wayne Rogers sacrificed his position on a historic television hit to maintain his professional dignity and avoid being marginalized by the network. He successfully clawed his way to massive independent wealth, proving he was vastly smarter than the studio executives who tried to ruin him. But in the end, the American public and the Hollywood establishment strictly remembered him for the exact same supporting role he had sacrificed his career to escape. The Hollywood PR machine instantly shifted into gear, publishing network obituaries that glossed over the systemic blacklisting he endured. The industry trades dedicated extensive coverage to his 3-year stint on a comedy series, bearing his vast financial empire and congressional testimony at the bottom of the page. They remembered him strictly for the supporting role he had sacrificed his television career to escape. Wayne Rogers successfully outmaneuvered the studios to secure his personal independence, but the corporate cartel ultimately ensured that victory cost him his artistic legacy.